Okay, for our second session, the focus here, another what I think of as an introductory chapter to the book of the Colorado River, but focusing in now more on climate as well as on tribal issues. So a combination of those two, and we've got some great speakers. But our moderator who'll get us started off, Ariana Brocious, we all get to hear her voice occasionally on our local NPR affiliates. But she is also a senior reporter, producer for Arizona Public Media. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you, Ariana.
Okay,
take your panel and run off.
Hi, good morning. I'm delighted to be here with such a great panel and to be talking about such important issues with all of you. So we're going to start off. This panel is focused on, as Jim said, climate change impacts and also the role of tribes and basin tribes in the conversations and negotiations over water supply and demand. So to start, we're going to have Pam Adams of Bureau of Reclamation give us an overview of two of the major reports the Bureau of Reclamation has done in recent years, looking at some of these major questions around supply and demand and the role of tribes. So if you want to just take it away. Okay.
Can I? Podium's a little high. Maybe I'll stand over here. Hi, nice to see you all. Nice to see you all. And first of all, I want to thank that first panel for doing such a nice job of setting the stage, talking about kind of our history, talking about current conditions as we look forward, as we start to transition into thinking, looking forward on the basin, and talk about these long-term planning efforts that have happened in the last decade. So I really appreciate you doing that. And if you remember, Dan showed some slides where he showed a very drastic decrease in the elevation of Lake Powell's and Lake Mead starting about 2000 to about 2005. There was a rapid, almost exponential decrease in the water elevations. So that decrease really led to increasing the concern, I would say, with reclamation and the basin states to think about future water supply and demand imbalances and to consider how we were going to address them. Thank you. All right, appreciate it. So in 2009, the 7 basin states and the Bureau of Reclamation initiated the Colorado River Water Supply and Demand Study. And this really, for a first time, holistically looked at the basin. We're going to consider supply throughout the basin and to think about demand, not just within the hydrologic basin, but also think about those demands for folks who live outside the basin and use Colorado River water, such as the Southern California area. And a really, I think, critical success to this Colorado River Basin study was the idea that it takes a partnership and it took many people and real collaboration to make this 3-year study a success. It was not just the basin states, it was not just reclamation, other federal entities, it was the NGOs, it was tribes, it was the public. We needed all their input and all their thoughts to make this basin study a success. So again, the objective was to think about future imbalances. We looked out 50 years, thinking about what water supply could be and demand could be, and then consider and evaluate and analyze mitigation options that could be used in the future to help reduce those imbalances. Oh, here we go. All right, so imagine you're sitting in the room here, imagine trying to think 50 years in advance. What's going to happen in 50 years, right? None of us can do it. As you saw, we can't even imagine or predict what the snowpack is going to be year to year. So in order to try to wrap our heads around what could happen in the basin, we had to use a scenario planning process. So we used scenarios for both water supply. So we considered the historic record, 100-year record we have on the Colorado River, and assumed that that's what would project for the next 50 years. We thought about, let's make it more variable. We looked at tree ring data. We tried to make it more complex. And then we used the international climate projections and thought, what could happen if we have a future climate that's different than what we see today, perhaps hotter, perhaps drier. So we incorporated those international climate projections into our scenarios so we could have a range of what the supply could be in the future. Then we had to really challenge ourselves, challenge the states, challenge the tribes, everyone, and say, what's your demand going to be in the future? And what are the factors that affect that demand? Population changes, changes in water use from perhaps irrigation to municipal and industrial, and all the other factors that could affect what water demands are. So we looked at 4 scenarios again, thinking about just taking the current trends and projecting them through 2060. Then we thought about what if it slows down, what if it increases, and then finally, what if we had a more sort of environmental and social consciousness in how we use water, and what would the demands of that scenario be? So once we had water supply, we had water demand, then we could think about what the range of the imbalance could be. And that imbalance projected to the future is a true range because we can't know what it's going to be. So this is where our expert modelers up in our Boulder office really progressed the state of the art of that modeling and challenged themselves to use their models in ways perhaps they hadn't used before to think about what that imbalance is. And sort of at the high end of that imbalance in 2060, it could be as much as 6 million acre feet per those scenarios, or as little as 0. So we can't know what's going to happen, but we can use this information to help us make decisions and talk about policy in the future. So once we realized we could have high imbalances in the future, we went out to the public, we went out to the stakeholders, we asked everyone, what are your ideas to help mitigate that? What are we going to do about it? And we got more than 150 ideas, and they ranged from giving everybody low-flow toilets to large infrastructure projects such as ocean desalination. And we realized that, well, not a single one of those things can solve the problem, but it takes a portfolio of things. And so we created several different portfolios and analyzed them and said, yes, these things could help. There's no one single solution, and it takes all of them together to make it work. This was a huge study, 3 years, lots and lots of analysis and lots of input, but what are some general conclusions we can get from it? The system is definitely vulnerable if we take no action. Remember, this is 2012. We weren't yet in a 20-year drought. We were in about a 10-year drought at that point, or 12-year drought at that point, but we realized we are vulnerable if we do nothing. If we do something, it greatly reduces it. So some of the consequences out of this were things like the pilot system conservation program that was raised earlier. In the near term, we realized all the portfolios said that if we do conservation, if we do things like voluntary conservation, things like that, it does help the system, as Dan and others talked about earlier. But in the longer term, if you're looking out 50 years, and if we see these large imbalances, then it takes larger scale projects, things like big infrastructure, ocean desalination, things like that to help help mitigate those imbalances. And those kinds of things have their own pros and cons and have their own risks. And that requires societal discussion across the basin. Do we want to go there? Is the risk worth it? How are we going to help mitigate if the imbalances are large in the future? So coming out of the basin study, there were about 10 next steps. And we recognized on the left that some of them were very clearly best led by the states. Things like water banking, excuse me. Things like that are really best done within the states. Some things are very much best done by reclamation. Things like furthering climate science. We work with many federal agencies, researchers, and we're part of a strong community to further that. Another important one on the lower right is the Tribal Water Study, which I'll talk about in a minute, which was a strong initiative by Ann Castle and Daryl Vigil with recognition that we needed to understand tribal water in the basin to much more detail. And so this was a strong outcome of the basin study. And in the middle, there was, as I said, a recognition that these near-term conservation efforts are important, and we wanted to study them in more detail. So we formed a team, a workshop of more than 100 people. They were technical experts, water managers, NGOs, tribes, to focus on 3 elements coming out of the basin study. One of them was municipal and industrial conservation. What are there clear opportunities we can take to conserve water? One of them was to understand agricultural water conservation more and to talk about transfers. So that was another group of experts that thought about opportunities and came up with potential actions that could be taken. And a third was, as mentioned, we recognized the importance of environmental and recreational flows. So there was a third work group that focused on those actions. The moving forward effort was started in 2013, right after the basin study was published. ended in 2015. These work groups came up with 25 main opportunities of things we could potentially do in the future and talked about challenges related to implementing each one of those. What was very interesting is there are similar findings across all 3 work groups. One of them is, first of all, we have to increase our data and tools, and we need more data in some areas where there's data gaps, and we have to constantly keep improving our tools so we can understand the system better. Another one is funding and incentives, of course. These days, everything's about creative funding, and so we had to think about opportunities related to that. Outreach and partnerships, critical. That kind of fed on the partnerships that were formed and strengthened through the basin study and then continued on through the moving forward effort. At the same time the moving forward effort was going on, again, through the strong support of Ann Castle and Daryl Vigil, Reclamation worked with the 10 tribes that formed the 10 Tribes Partnership to work on a tribal water study to understand the very important water rights that these 10 tribes have in the Colorado River Basin and effects that could occur when they develop their full use of their water. Again, we were building on the Colorado River Basin study, so we wanted to use the same approach. We wanted it to be a technical study to help foster these later discussions. And I was the Reclamation's lead for that study, and I have to say, it was a pleasure and my honor to have worked on that study. Although it took a little longer than we had hoped, it turned out to be 5 years. It was a wonderful effort to, I think, challenging both Reclamation and pushed our kind of norms of how we do studies, and I think challenged the tribes to think about how they're currently using water and how they could develop in the future. So I think that the whole effort just really strengthened that relationship and Reclamation's recognition of how critical tribes are in the basin. We use the same process. We use the water supply scenarios that have come from the basin study. And then the tribes came up with their own scenarios of how they could develop water in the future. And this, Daryl may be able to talk about this more, but this was not an easy process. It's never easy to sit there in a room and to think about how you may use water for the next 50 years. And this was, these scenarios and the quantification of these scenarios was done by all the 10 tribes' participation. They involved tribal leadership, tribal technical staff. So it was a very collaborative and really relied on everyone's input to make it a success. So again, once we had the water supply scenarios, what their future development could be, then we could look at effects of the development on this water on the system. And we had metrics for the upper basin and metrics for the lower basin, basically Lake Powell elevations and shortage or deliverables in the lower basin, water supply deliverables in the lower basin. And then when he had thought about those metrics, we really challenged these 10 tribes to think about what are the challenges you have to currently using your water, to future development of your water, and what are opportunities related to those challenges. The water use and development findings, these 10 tribe partnership tribes have unsettled water diversion rights and unsettled diversion claims to nearly 2.8 million acre feet of water in the basin. Currently, they're using about half of that, mostly for irrigation purposes. Under the development scenarios, most of the tribes are going to full development by 2040. And as we did our modeling, similar to what we did in the basin study, the metrics that we used indicated that it's future climate that has more of an impact on the system than the development of this tribal water. There are slight changes in the elevations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, but they are masked by far by future water supplies that could be much smaller. The tribe identified, again, these challenges that they have to using their water, things like recognition of their federal water rights, environmental water uses, funding, partnerships, again, getting information out across the basin to the importance of their water and the importance of them in the basin. That was a critical part. Again, data collection is really critical. So this theme is consistent throughout all 3 of these studies that we're seeing It takes partnerships. We need more information in some cases, and it's not easy, and it takes everyone to do it. So these 3 studies represent a decade of planning in the Colorado River Basin. It's proactive planning, it's innovative, and they really lay the technical foundation for these technical and partnership foundations, I'll just say it very bluntly, to the policy discussions that are happening and management approaches that are occurring now. So the development of the drought contingency plannings, they are using these technical foundations and the partnership foundations to make those new plans a success. And these themes of partnerships, the need for good data and modeling, the need for flexibility, they will continue being used now, and they'll be continued to use in the future in the basin.
Thank you, Pam. Next, we're going to have Kathy Jacobs, who's the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation, Science, and Solutions at the University of Arizona, give us an overview of the projected climate impacts in the Colorado River Basin.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to start out by establishing my credibility. I have, in fact, rafted on the Colorado River. And B, the greatest moment in my professional career was the moment when Bruce Babbitt said that I was a dominatrix with whips and chains. So unfortunately, I don't think he's in the room right now, but that was actually, it's all been downhill since. I worked for the Arizona Department of Water Resources for 23 years, and so have a long history with water management. But I did evolve into being a climate person over time, so I now do both. I am currently working on some Colorado River-related conversations that are intended to sort of open the box that we heard Bruce Babbitt talk about this morning. You know, what are the possibilities for the future that we could be thinking about? But in the meantime, what I'm here to do today is to talk to you a little bit about climate science and the role of the National Climate Assessment. I think it is incredibly important that we have a credible arbiter of what we know and what we don't know, and that's really what both the International Panel on Climate Change and the National Climate Assessment do. We've been working for the last several decades. We've now had 5 sets of International Panel on Climate Change reports and 4 sets of national climate assessments. The National Climate Assessment is essentially the U.S. version of what is it that we know, how do we know it, and what are the uncertainties. I had the incredible privilege of running the U.S. National Climate Assessment in the Obama administration. I was there for 4 years. And we had a lot of scope to really try to move this process to a place where we are generating information that's truly useful, as opposed to writing a report that's mostly used by scientists. And so the focus that we really tried to establish was to advance an inclusive, broad-based, and sustained process. This isn't anymore about writing reports. It's really about trying to support decisions, and also communicating what it is that we know and engaging with people across the country, as opposed to focusing exclusively on scientists inside the Beltway. You can imagine that things look very different when you have grown up and spent your entire career inside the Beltway than they do to those of us who have spent decades in the trenches. And so sort of bridging that gap is a really incredible challenge. But I think it is also very important that we move forward because of the urgency of these climate issues. I am going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about the most recent National Climate Assessment report. I actually led the 3rd report, which came out in 2014, and as many of you undoubtedly noted, there actually was another one, and it came out during the Trump administration's, in the last couple of months, actually. So it was in November of 2018 that the 4th assessment report came out. And obviously the bottom line is not dramatically different from the bottom lines that we heard in previous assessments, because in fact it was a scientific report. First of all, the climate is changing. It's happening now. It's happening extremely rapidly, and in fact it's accelerating. Secondly, severe weather is becoming more intense. Sea levels are rising and oceans are being affected dramatically. Incredible changes in the oceans and in the Arctic. It's largely happening because of human activities, and there are so many different avenues now to show that that is true. The climate will continue to change over coming decades, and one of the reasons we know that is this graph that you see at the bottom, which is unfortunately a little hard to see very clearly. But what I can see, and you can't, is that in the extreme right-hand end of this graph, it shows where we are in 2017 in terms of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. The rest of the graph shows the relationship between global average temperatures and carbon dioxide. And I don't know if there's, oh, there is. So up here is where we are in 2017 for carbon dioxide. All the rest of this time you can see the tracking of carbon dioxide against global temperature. Sorry, I'm not trying to blind you. There's a complete tracking, but look at where carbon dioxide is right now. So what do you think that means about the temperatures of the future? We've got a lot to adjust to and need to be significantly prepared for a lot more change than we've already seen. And of course, we have already seen lots. 16 of the last 17 years are the warmest years on record. Globally, the annually average temperature has increased by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like very much, except when you look at how it's distributed across the globe, it is not even. We are not all experiencing this the same way, and there are places where there is incredibly dramatic change going on, and I'm not even talking about the extremes. There's actually very dramatic change sort of in average conditions, especially close to the poles. And then, as I mentioned, in the oceans. 2016 was the warmest year on record until 2017, and we've just seen a lot of very hot years recently. And of course, though I don't think people fully understood, and I think scientists would readily agree with this, we did not realize how apparent the impacts already were until probably around the third National Climate Assessment, the one that I led. We found impacts of climate change in every sector in every region, and it's very easy to trace the connections now. Historically, it was more about how we understood the energy cycle. Now it's about what we're actually observing, and that's a pretty dramatic switch from where we were before. And the fourth assessment report does a great job of documenting that certain types of extreme events are really showing important trends. And so the extremes are becoming more extreme. Heat waves are generally increasing in number and intensity. Cold waves, of course, are decreasing. This is not a big surprise. More precipitation is coming as larger events, and that's what this graphic is right now on the right-hand side. This basically shows the dramatic increase in intensity of precipitation across the country, particularly in the Northeast, but across the entire northern tier, and even in the Southwest, where we're experiencing declines in total precipitation. We are also seeing increases in intensity of precipitation. So what this means is we're facing more periods of drought and more periods of flooding. It's just the total amount of precipitation is actually reducing. That's often a complicated thing for people to get a grip on. But we've seen increasing risk of floods, and not just risk of floods. We're actually in one right now in the Midwest, very significant. Increasing intensity of droughts in the Southwest and Southeast. Incidence of large wildfires has increased. Obviously, all of you have noticed this. This is one of the areas where I think we've finally gotten the American public's imagination is focused on these things, having what has happened in the West and in California recently, and then all of the cascading effects that have occurred. It's pretty hard to ignore the climate signal there. And then increasing intensity of hurricanes is expected. There's still a little argument about which components of hurricanes are climate change induced as opposed to the normal patterns. But there's a lot of linkages there. In this last National Climate Assessment report does a much better job than previous reports have done in linking the choices that we have about our emissions management programs to the impacts on our economy. So clearly that's been one of the stories that has not been told well, and it is not because journalists haven't tried. It's because a lot of the data are not there to really demonstrate clearly what the cost of inaction is versus the cost of action. But the cost of inaction is getting a little clearer, and it's very obvious that it matters tremendously which one of these emissions trajectories we choose to be on. We're currently on the upper version. We have choices about whether or not we're going to go in. Whether we're going to go into one of the. I'm going forward when I want to go back. This is a really challenging little device here. Oops, there I went. Okay. There I was. Anyway, I'm done with that story. I'm moving on. A really important thing, and it has actually been picked up in the media a lot, is the advances in detection and attribution for severe weather events. You know, historically, I think there was a lot of argument about the degree to which each individual event was variability versus climate change. And of course, what we're seeing now is the effect of variability on top of a trend. And so we're seeing more extremes, and it's very actually hard to tell that story. But new advances in particularly statistical analysis now allow us to see what component of extreme events is attributable to climate change as opposed to variability. And so this is really helpful. We've even been able to do it proactively in the context of hurricanes as they're developing. As we saw with the one that hit Houston this last year, they were actually saying what component of it was connected to climate change or couldn't have happened without climate change before the thing hit land. And so that's actually pretty amazing. But you know, there's a lot of complexity here, so this is my one slide to try to make it simple. It is going to get hotter, period. There is no question about that. Stream flow is likely to be reduced. I would say that's pretty certain also, impacting our supplies, of course. Evapotranspiration will increase, and that's, of course, the use of water by plants. That affects demand for agriculture and for natural habitat. It will be drier on average, but with more intense rainstorms. And so we have to be prepared for both flooding and drought. There's a likelihood, and I will say a certainty, of cascading effects increasing, including heat waves and resulting brownouts because of impacts on the electric system, or forest fires, air quality problems, health effects, a whole range of potential cascading effects on systems, because our systems are linked. And of course, things like sedimentation of reservoirs that is happening more because of forest fires. Lake Mead, as you heard, is currently at the lowest level since the reservoirs were initially filled. And Arizona in particular has to be concerned about that, as you've already heard. Serious implications for ecosystems, human health, and historically disadvantaged populations. I personally would like to hear a lot more about the impacts of climate change on ecosystems, because I think we're really at a threshold for many of those ecosystems, and that's not been well enough articulated. So there's a good suggestion, more stories on that. Anyway, the heat component of this story is really the critical thing, because heat is actually driving not only many of the impacts, but the impacts on other things, but the impacts on water availability. The connection between heat and runoff has in recent years become incredibly clear. And this diagram that's from the fourth assessment report, I think, does a good job of explaining this. What this is the Colorado River flow, which is declining. What this is the temperature, which is increasing. What this is the precipitation, which is not doing much at all. And what are we seeing? A huge decline in water supplies. So obviously there's a strong role being played by heat, and in fact, the documentation of that has become much more clear in recent years with publications of papers such as one by Udall and Overpeck that talked about the whole impacts of hot droughts. And we have lots of data about how dramatic the shift has been towards hot and dry. All of these represent water years. The ones that are to the right-hand side of this graph really show the declines. And as you can see, first of all, the evidence is that there's warming everywhere. We're seeing record-setting flow reductions and lots of temperature-induced losses, snowpack loss faster than we really had anticipated, and earlier runoff, which of course affects a lot, especially in the upper basin. So there's been a lot of conversation about the role of science in all of this, and I've been trying to contribute to that, working through the University of Arizona and some recent workshops that we've been supporting. There are a number of academics who believe there's many more topics that need to be evaluated moving forward, and so science really can make additional contributions. First of all, thinking more about the full range of plausible flow reductions. We really have not explored the outer edges of the risk. The implications for groundwater, and we're not just talking about groundwater along rivers, we're talking about the fact that groundwater turns out to be the source of last resort whenever the surface water supply becomes less available. We see dramatic impacts in California along those lines. Extreme floods, the real dangers that could happen to our dams, and all kinds of changes to sediment that could happen along those lines. The accuracy and relevance of water demand forecasts could be improved. All kinds of new news is needed relative to ecological and biodiversity impacts and ways to manage those impacts. Water quality, particularly salinity, but other issues as well, needs to be integrated. And you heard Anne talk about the changes in the modeling approaches that can start to bring some of these things together. But I think possibly the most important are the last two in my list: climate change vulnerability across coupled human and environmental systems. It's very easy to think about, well, it's actually nearly impossible, but it is very easy to think about conceptually these things individually, like the impacts on electric supply generation or the impacts on water availability for agriculture. But when you start thinking about all the systems components to all of these things, how they're linked to ecological systems and human systems and water rights systems, and they are so interrelated, we have not done a good job of looking at vulnerability across those linked systems. And then thinking about the impact of climate change on integrated physical systems, that's a little bit easier, but both of those are actually incredibly challenging, and we really need to make progress there. So there is, in fact, a lot of good news in terms of progress. We have, in fact, spawned a new generation of baby basin studies. So the Bureau of Reclamation is working on ones that weren't mentioned by Pam, including 3 in Arizona, 1 on the lower Santa Cruz River basin that I've been working on. And we see a lot of potential now to use new scientific information integrated into the supply and demand analysis, and explicitly consider, for example, environmental impacts, but also adaptation options. So there's lots of challenges for climate change for decision makers. Many decision makers really want a path to the future. They want to know what exactly the future is going to look like, and we cannot tell them. There's a lot of uncertainty there, but we do understand the trends, and that's really more than enough for most managers. If they really understand the trends well, they can make a lot of change. And of course, understanding these cascading effects is pretty critical. But I think the value component of this is probably more important than anything else, and that includes, what do we mean by success when we're defining and assessing our adaptation options? Are we really thinking about the costs and benefits to the full range of people involved? Are we thinking about the costs of action versus inaction? Are we thinking about the potential for adverse consequences of our very well-intended management options? Are we doing a good job of monitoring both the baseline and the changes that occur as a result of our own management efforts? Have we really understood when we have to move from these sort of incremental solutions to transformational solutions? And are we really thinking about environmental justice and social justice and equity issues in a meaningful way? so that the future of this river is really serving all of us and not just a few of us. So we're in a situation now where we have a lot of choices. Our future depends on how we act relative to climate change, and that means both how we manage mitigation or emission strategies and what we do about adaptation. And so we have a big challenge before us, and all of you are critical in getting us to the outcomes that we actually are hoping for. So thank you very much, and I will be quiet now.
No, you're going to be answering questions.
I'll be noisy now. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kathy. So, like the last panel, we'll be having some conversation here, and you're welcome to ask questions. So if you have them, we have time reserved at the end, but if you have one that you're just dying to ask, go ahead and stand up and we'll take it in the middle of this conversation. So Daryl, I want to start with you. You were the lead of the 10 Tribes Partnership during the study, and I was curious if you could tell us a bit about the perspective of the tribes in participating in this, and what was the motivation and the perspective from that side of it, from that side of the table.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. And a lot of you have heard this story before, so I'm going to go through it probably pretty quickly. Call myself the accidental water guy because water isn't my background. So when I first got involved with the partnership, in 2009, it was pretty much in mothballs, and at the same time, Reclamation was engaging in the broader basin study, and we were, overlooked in that particular process. I used to say excluded, but I'll say overlooked this time. And that really gave, the partnership, kind of the springboard to move forward in terms of, what we saw as absolutely a lack of recognition and understanding about tribes in the basin. And always start off with the context of, there's 567 federally recognized tribes, and each distinct sovereign entities, culturally, geographically, language, all those kind of things. And so if you know one tribe, you know one tribe. And so given that context, moving into this thing, just saw this huge disparity of ignorance in terms of tribal water rights and tribes in general. And so using, kind of that oversight of the broader basin study, we really used that as an opportunity to move forward with our own organization, which was formed in 1992 by some really visionary leadership of Leonard Birch, Levi Posada, Peterson Zah, Nora McDowell, and that level of tribal leadership that was pretty unique to that particular period of time, who formed this organization to have access to policy and to look at management and hopefully to be a part of that process. Well, it didn't happen right away. It took till 2009 and ultimately to 2010 to really start creating some of that recognition. And so, utilizing our anger at the time, poor Terry and Terry Fulp and Larry Wakowiak, we really used it, you have a trust responsibility, Terry, and you're not fulfilling it. But we had never really set what that expectation was, and then Reclamation had their own idea of trust responsibility. And so we really used it, the partnership, to really regroup in terms of who we are as an organization. It's like, if we're going to really make an impact, and we're going to go out to the broader world about who we are and why it's important that we participate or engage in this process, then we better find out where we operate from. We created a vision statement. And the vision statement says that we're going to lead from a spiritual mandate to protect the river and all living creatures, and pretty powerful. And then how are we going to execute that vision? It's what former Secretary and Governor Babbitt was talking about this morning, that we're going to educate, collaborate, and communicate about what we're up to, and to show that who we are, to create relatedness. And that's at the kind of the heart of what the tribal water study is. 10 different distinct stories from each tribe talking about what they think and what they value about water, and how they're part of already of the broader communities that we live in, and to really start to look at how we see our role to be, and not only currently but into the future. And so that's kind of a quick version of how we got to be in the tribal water study. It started off contentious, but it really came up with ending up being that we forged partnership and relationships with Reclamation and with other stakeholders to begin with. And individuals like Ann Castle, and Mike Connor, and Larry Wakowiak, and Terry Falk, and Pam Adams, and Carly Jicarilla, who we created, relationships with and partnerships with, and they really understood the importance of the fact that, you're dealing with the law of the river from 1992, and the reality is, for my tribe, is in 1922, we were still living in teepees and pooping in the woods. And that's a fact. And then we didn't get to vote until 1934, and maybe, we started to organize in 1934 with the Indian Regal Org Act, and then some of us didn't get to vote until 1957. So we're way behind the game. And we really saw that the tribal water study was an opportunity really to help us start to bridge that capacity gap that exists in reality in terms of what do we do with tribes? That's always the thing. And so when you're talking about, the 10 Tribes Partnership as an entity having 20% of the volume of the river, but not having any access to any of the traditional, policy tables is, as we talk about equity and maybe unconscionable to a large extent. How is it that we do that? It absolutely was not in the, our ability and our success didn't lie in traditional, those pathways that tribes thought of in terms of beating your chest and claiming sovereignty and those kind of things, because that just didn't work. And so our ability now is really looking at showing the outside world how we fit into that broader picture and how we can make a difference. And some of the conversations this morning about, well, what is the long-term answer? And I really like, some of the things Dr. Jack Schmidt talks about in terms of we're asking ourselves the wrong questions in terms of policy in the river. When I first got involved with this process, I was like, why can't we change the law of the river? You can't, Daryl. And I'm like, well, why not? Well, because it just can't be done. And I think, and again, asking ourselves the wrong questions. Yeah, drought contingency planning is great. It took a collaborative effort between the 7 basin states and finally some inclusion of some tribes. But then you still see, and I really appreciate the opinion piece that came out just recently, from the 7 basin states and some of the conservation groups. But if you look at it closely, there's no real tribal citations. There wasn't tribes involved with that group that went on behalf of the 7 basin states to DC. And so we're listed as 22 federally recognized tribes in the basin, but we weren't part of that process. And until we create the structure to include us in that process, it's lip service to a large extent. And so
let me jump in there because I want to ask, so what are some of because tribes have such a significant amount of water rights, many of which are unresolved or unclaimed, not fully developed, what are some of the challenges for tribes to develop those, and what are some of the things tribes would like to use them for, besides agriculture, more agriculture, those kinds of things?
we absolutely think, and we already have been a part of the solution unknowingly to a whole lot of people. When we talk about unused tribal entitlements in the basin, where do those go to? I thought it was really great, and I love Metropolitan's willingness to actually have these conversations now. But when you talk about the willingness to lend that support, they receive a whole lot of that unused entitlement. And so when we start to talk about those challenges, like for my particular tribe, we have 40,000 acre feet of water rights. We're at the, in northern New Mexico, our water flows right, to the Four Corners through the San Juan River, and our settlement water, one is in terms of storage facilities, one is 25 miles away from the reservation, the other one is 40 miles away from the reservation. No way to actually utilize that. So we have a marketing program. We've been able to lease water, but there's no market in New Mexico for lease water right now. And it's a huge component in terms of our ability to generate revenue for housing and those kind of social programs on the reservation. And so our access to markets outside the reservation, and pathways to that do not exist. And anytime you talk about, well, can we move this? Can we be allowed to do this? And supposedly we're sovereigns and we're supposed to be self-determined in our ability to move that water, but we can't move it across state lines. And so given the nature of our predicament, the challenges are all in the structure that's already been laid out for us and policies that have been laid out long before we were ever a consideration. And so you're putting, trying to develop tribal water rights on top of a system that's completely broken and that's on the verge of collapse.
Well, so how do we respond then? Maybe Pam, you can jump in. I mean, if we have these water rights that you're looking to develop, but we have some water leasing, some water banking happening now, is there more options for that, especially for tribes who have water that they may or may not want to use in the near term, but could benefit from if they're able to lease it? Go ahead.
Absolutely, and I think that's at the heart of some of the conversations that 10 Tribes has been having, and another project that I'm working on called Water and Tribes in the Colorado River Basin. And everybody gets freaked out by the term marketing, but so we're calling it water sharing. And again, looking at common sense solutions in terms of how we deal with water management in the basin. And so at the heart of it is like, again, we're talking about the next set of interim guidelines. And so we definitely are making it, building those partnerships and pathways with the federal government and with other stakeholders in the basin to really be a part of that process. But I think, in terms of tribes, until we really start to address, the law of the river and have the frank conversations of how tribes fit into that scenario. But the thing is that, again, being late to the game that we didn't create and just starting to know the rules and the basic, I think I look at the law of the river as, contentious from the get-go, protect, defend. And so if you're looking at the law of the river and that we operate from, that, the foundation is protect, defend, whatever your area is, there's not a basis for much to be built upon that.
Pam, what's the role of reclamation here in terms of maybe helping bridge some of those gaps, or is there funding federally available to do water projects, storage, those kinds of things?
Sure. Excuse me, I apologize. This beautiful weather has just kicked in my allergies. Sorry, I apologize for my coughing fits up here. I guess I'll answer that as by most of our answers, which is it takes a range of things. And in the tribal water study and our summary, we have identified in the last chapter 9, which is the summary, we have a table in there which identifies kind of potential next steps that the partnership has identified and some that have reclamation have identified. And they're related to those categories that kind of pinwheel slide I had that are those particular challenges. But one of them, talking about funding, is we recognize that unfortunately funding is short these days. We never satisfies what we would like it to do. So it takes partnerships, it takes leveraging, and one of our actions that we'd like to take as reclamation is to make sure that the information on those programs are getting out to the tribes, that we're thinking about how we creatively partner to foster that that information, the capability and the capacity of the tribes to apply for that funding, if it's a federal grant funding, and to really facilitate the building of those partnerships to help maximize those funding opportunities.
If anyone has questions, begin to come up and we'll take them, but I'm going to keep asking the panel in the
If I
meantime.
could just add one thing about that too. I mean, so in terms of having some building in flexibility in terms of a tribe to be able to develop their water rights, a huge issue with tribes and their ability to develop their water rights is infrastructure. And so when you start to talk about, Pam's talking about lack of maybe funds and money that's available to that, that could be, circumvented to a large extent by creating that flexibility so that the tribes were able to, market their unused entitlements, then they would have the ability maybe to pay for some infrastructure and some planning and to build capacity and those kind of things. So it's kind of a catch-22 for us because, on one hand, we really want to go forward, but on the other hand, the structure restricts us from doing that.
And are there existing arrangements now and markets that are operating and working well in this way?
Absolutely.
Sure, I think some of the flexibility you're seeing within the river system will be talked about tomorrow with the Gila River Indian tribes, and Governor Lewis will be talking about his tribe's participation in the drought contingency planning. That flexibility is I would say, innovative and new within the basin. The Colorado River Indian tribes have also committed to working on drought contingency planning, and in a way that 10 years ago when we were writing the Colorado River Basin study may not have ever been considered, that we have this flexibility and real creative problem solving helping forward. And this is my opinion that will only continue as supplies get strained, demand increases, that flexibility and those creative solutions will just become more and more.
So I want to pivot a little bit to climate. They're obviously related issues, but so in the 10 Tribes study, there was a line I noted that the authors wrote that, and you touched on this, Pam, despite the amount of water that there is, that's overshadowed by climate and what will be the impacts, and nature is still in charge was sort of the phrase in there. So Kathy, starting with you, when we look ahead and are trying to plan for these unpredictable futures, given the information we have now, what do we need to do? We have these scenarios, multiple kinds of portfolio options. Do we need shorter horizons to be more flexible? What's the best path?
Well, I think the most important thing is to not think about what we're engaged in now as a drought, and that we will at some point return to normal, quote unquote. And I also don't think that even the concept of a new normal is all that useful, because the new normal is actually change. And so if we start from that point, instead of starting from the point that, the conditions under which all of these institutions and infrastructures were built, they're no longer the case. And so why don't we use this as an opportunity actually to reframe the conversation so that we can get to some better outcomes that hopefully actually serve everyone from a perspective of quality of life and quality of the environment. So I am hoping that the fact that we actually know the future will be warmer, period, that is not in question. Even if we dramatically reduce our emissions right now, we are going to be getting warmer for decades into the future. We can't pretend that's not the case. The real question is really, how quickly are we going to get this situation under control so that the rate of change slows down and we have a better chance of a better outcome?
We have a question. Go ahead.
I'm Rivard from Voice San Diego. Daryl, back in 2007, when the states were coming together for the interim guidelines, I believe at least one of the 10 tribes expressed concern that the water banking that was being created was creating these sort of long-term deals that locked tribes out of developing their water rights. Do tribes have the same concern about the DCP, just sort of extending longer-term water deals into the future and locking you out?
I wasn't involved in 2007, so I can't speak to that too much. But no, when we're start talking about drought contingency planning again, it's something that I think is, it's immediate and it's something that's on the horizon right now. But it begs the question again of, what's the long range plan look like in terms of the management of the Colorado River, and as we move forward, I think we look at demand management as it's related to DCP in the upper basin, because that's where we're at. And one of the things that it doesn't take into consideration is unused tribal entitlements. And so really having the frank discussion about, well, let's have a conversation about, those unused entitlements and who's getting them at this point in time. And they're getting them for free. And so as we move forward, absolutely we see that, one of the things that we haven't done a good job on is really, tribes, and my tribe in particular, haven't done a good job in terms of creating that partnership at the state level. Because, it's the basin states and the Upper Colorado River Commission, that really, in our area, determine, what's going to happen. And so there are no provisions, in the Upper Colorado River Commission to have Indian or tribal representation. But now that we have somebody like an Amy Hawes in there who's open to the idea of absolutely hearing tribal voices, then I think that there's an opportunity for us to move forward.
Go ahead.
Hello there, I'm Jared Smith from Freshwater News in Denver. As you know, the Utah Utes asked for a seat on the Upper Colorado River Commission formally in December Are you hopeful that that will occur? And if that does occur, will it give you guys meaningful tools to play a bigger role in the way the water is being allocated right now?
You know, that whole conversation is kind of, again, you know, a catch-22 for us, because, you know, if you acknowledge the existence of the Colorado River Compact that has specific language that says it doesn't apply to tribes, then you acknowledge the reality of Upper Colorado River Commission, and they're pretty straightforward. And I understand the way they're structured now doesn't have provisions for tribes to be included in that. You'd have to go back and change the law. And as Pam was talking about, you know, in the tribal water study, in the table 9A of the tribal water study, it looks at, you know, future potential actions. And at the heart of it, the number one is looking at, you know, law, policy, and legislation. And so for us, you know, ramping up these conversations, the first step being the tribal water study in terms of creating relatedness and educating about the water rights of each individual of the 10 Tribes Partnership, we really see that as a platform for us to start the broader conversation of legislation change, policy change.
So, Pam, you mentioned that the Bureau in the supply and demand study created a series of potential futures and potential solutions. Can you explain some of the solutions that might be, and be specific if you can, most useful in the short term, things that we might actually begin to do or are already doing now that will help us at least in the next 20 years?
Sure. Again, as part of the analysis in the basin study, we recognized that we couldn't just analyze a single individual action, that we built portfolios of actions. And there were 4 portfolios, and each one had a theme or a trend. So one of them was conservation-based and levels of conservation-based. And so what we recognized that some of them were very near, short-term, 10 years out, let's say, and some of them are longer term. But in the short term, there are definitely actions that have been taken, that states have been doing. For instance, increasing water reuse. Reclamation is helping fund programs to do research on water research on water reuse, desalinization, funding reuse when we can have the ability to fund programs like that. So there's lots of near-term conservation that is absolutely happening. And Southern Nevada Water Authority is certainly a lead in, I'd say, the west in the world, really, in their levels of conservation and their innovative thinking and planning for that conservation and how they're managing their water. So I think that has continued through nearly a decade since the basin study and only continues. There are specific actions in that moving forward report that was published in 2015, and now might be the time for a commercial break. Both of those reports are available online, but as part of your conference attendance, I am going to leave thumb drives of the travel water study somewhere out there on a table. So if you're interested, feel free to pick them up, and don't have to necessarily access that online. But all those reports are available. Easiest way to Google them, easiest way to get them is just Google them on the Reclamation websites. We've tried to organize them into chapters, so if you just want to go to summaries and just look at those potential actions, you might find them very interesting, and they're absolutely being implemented from both the federal perspective and the state perspective.
Hi, Dave White from ASU. I want to go back to the title of the panel and the post-colon piece, how warming is changing everything. And Kathy really summarized well the growing consensus within the scientific community that climate change impacts are materializing faster and in more severe ways than even each prior assessment projected. And I think many of us would argue that the innovations, despite all the remarkable work that's been done by folks like yourselves, and I applaud some of the positive steps in collaboration and inclusion. Many of us who examine governance issues argue that the innovations on the policy and governance side are nowhere near fast enough, and that we are simply being outpaced by the changes in the physical environment. And there's little evidence to believe that our ability to collaboratively govern these issues in ways that will allow for effective adaptation is in sight. So I'd just like to challenge the fact that I don't believe warming is changing everything on the policy side. And so how can we move way faster, much faster than what we're doing? And I appreciate the barriers, as you mentioned, Daniel, some of the structural, or Daryl, some of the structural barriers that we've all faced. But we have to move much faster. How can we do that?
Thanks a lot. I do think that we need to start from a perspective of we don't have to be locked in to the past. That being said, there is so much money invested in where we are today, and so much sort of political baggage in sort of impeding progress towards other futures. But if we can have conversations where we basically take all of our hats off and talk about our children and our grandchildren and species and tribes and, you know, topics that we really haven't talked about, you know, I think we would come up with a very different solution if we started with our children and our grandchildren and species and U.S.-Mexico relations and tribal considerations. We would draw a very different picture. It's just whether we'll be given permission to even have that conversation, because there are people who don't even want a hypothetical conversation of that kind. We have to have that conversation. But thanks a lot.
I'm Tony Davis again, and a question for Daryl. So this, as I heard Pam summing up the study, there was a 2-point-something million acre feet of unresolved tribal water rights or something, and 1.2 million. Some of it is already being used, but 1.2 million acre feet is being unused. So how are we going to get from here to there? And is this going to involve a lot of Indian versus non-Indian conflict, or do you think it can be worked out by collaboration?
Maybe, if you don't mind, I'll just kind of clarify some of those points.
Sorry, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's complicated and very confusing, and the language is very confusing, frankly, if you're not a lawyer. So we've identified, the 10 tribes of the partnership identified 2.8 million acre feet that they either have rights to, Federal Reserve water rights, through settlements or adjudications, through court cases, and or unresolved claims. So 2.8 that they think that they have the right to, unless some of it's unresolved.
And it's none of it is being used then?
No, it is about about half of it. 1.4 is currently being used.
And I was asking about the remaining 1.4 million, given the competing demands on the river, given the DCPs and the cuts that are already being made. Are these going to be accommodated? The remaining 1.4 million, can this be accommodated through collaboration and negotiation, or do you think conflict is inevitable over this?
I mean, John Fleck, waters for fighting over, right? But we hope that the pathway for us right now, and the strategy is, of course, education, collaboration, communication, and forging partnerships. And we really see that, you talk about 1.5 million acre feet. I think 400,000 of that is in the upper basin. And so, what I think really needs to be understood is that 1.5 million is already being used by somebody in the system,
Right.
but not tribes. That's a real critical thing to get, because it's not like additional water in the system. We're just not using it right now. And that's part of the tribal water study's intent, was creating those scenarios, fast growth. So if we were to develop our full water rights, within the next 30 years, what does that look like to the basin?
Because in many cases, those rights are senior
Right.
to most others. And so you really have a sense, a power in terms of negotiation.
Yeah, and that's why, having those frank conversations that people have been, the word fear was thrown around this morning, but, with those entities about like Metropolitan and some of those who are using some of this unused tribal water, and they're not the only ones, but they're the ones I'm having a conversation with right now, so I feel like I'm able to say that. And their openness and their willingness to be part of that dialogue. And ultimately, the unused tribal water and the people that are using it, will that get paid for in some way? that's what we're hoping for.
And if you don't mind, I was going to say, and I think one of the values of the tribal water study is for communities and states to understand the uncertainty related to that tribal water study, to understand the risks when development could occur, and so we can be proactively and think about that in the future rather than being surprised 10 or 15 years.
So as we're seeing the DCP sort of finally get wrapped up, we're gearing up for the next round of negotiations, and I know there's been some criticism about maybe lack of climate data or that information being included, tribal information and those concerns. So how do we prepare for the next round, and how do we make sure that those are part of the discussions? Anybody can start.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge the work that Kathy and Brad, you all do, and all the rosy scenarios for the future.
You're welcome.
And my point being that, I think it's a reality, and given the nature that everything is connected, what can you learn from tribes in terms of their existence in this country for the last 10, 15,000 years was that our ability to live in some type of balance. And I think that conversation absolutely sometimes is left out, and it can't be left out. And it goes to begging the broader question of who do we want to be in terms of who we are in the basin as human beings? And what does that look like in terms of the vision, not only of somebody turning on their faucet, in Southern California, but for the endangered fish too. And what does that all look like in those areas? What do we want that to look like? And those are the questions that we need to be talking about with each other. What does that look like? What does balance look like?
So I'd like to use this as my opportunity for a commercial break, and that is, I mentioned the importance of the National Climate Assessment in supporting essentially the credible scientific foundation for all these conversations. It is not enough, and we need to get to a place where citizens play a more active role in National Climate Assessment type of activities. In this next week, there's going to be an announcement of the creation of a citizen-based National Climate Assessment, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you in upcoming days about what that exactly means. But we need to empower people with facts. They need to be part of the process of generating those facts so that they actually understand what they need and believe what they say. And we've really seen the power of this in moving the National Climate Assessment as far as we have, which is from a purely inside the Beltway experience to a very broadly owned process where scientists across the country and managers play a significant role. But there's a real opportunity for having science be much more engaged in processes like planning for the Colorado River. And I'd love to explore with all of you what that means and the role you could play in trying to make that happen. Thank you very much.
Well, we have a few minutes left, so if you have any other questions, please feel free to come up. But one thing I'm kind of curious about is one of the climate predictions has to do with when precipitation falls in the winter and the temperature changing it from rain to snow, or snow to rain, excuse me. And that may have impacts not only for runoff and floods, but also storage in the basin. And so I know there'll be other panels later in the conference that might address this in more detail, but what are some of the things we need to do for flexibility within the system now for those climate changes, whether they are 30-year drought or snowpack becoming essentially rain?
So it really depends what your management objective is. I mean, if you're trying to manage streams for fish habitat, you have a different answer to that question than if you're managing streams for maximum diversion for human use. And obviously changes in seasonality have a great deal to do with ecosystems, but it also has to do with how much loss there is due to changes in temperature. And so we are actually losing more water as a result of having less water held in snowpack for longer in the season. And so it is an integrated, heat and snowpack question. But really everything has to do with what are you trying to accomplish. You can optimize for any single objective without that much difficulty. But if you're trying to optimize across a whole range of issues, across multiple scales, across the upper basin and the lower basin and Mexico and tribes, and you care about fish, and you care about sediment, and you really would not like to see more forest fires, and by the way, you'd really like the Bureau of Reclamation to continue to exist because the political situation has not gotten so hot they can't even survive anymore. I mean, how do you solve all those problems at once? I mean, this is a grand challenge if there ever was one.
Well, so as a follow-up to that, Pam, one of the solutions that you mentioned, or one of the portfolio options, was a conservation focused and maybe with more environmental flows. So who are the people deciding which of those options we take?
So an important part of coming out of the basin study, the moving forward, the tribal water study, is to understand that it is a planning effort. We laid the technical foundation for these very important policy discussions, for these decision makers to help guide their future decisions. So there's not going to be you're not going to pick one portfolio, or you're not going to pick just a single option coming out of that. But as the if I can say it, the consciousness of the basin changes, as we all learn more, as our values change and our goals change, those things will all be reflected in future policy decisions and how we manage our systems.
And just to the direct impact, of this on our reservation, it was evident this year. We had 3 feet one day, next day there was nothing. And for us, in terms of rangeland and those kind of things, I mean, it becomes a tinder box, and so we end up having, again, stretched limited tribal resources because of that reason. And where do we take those resources that we allocate to fire suppression and drought and those kind of things on the reservation? Have to come from somewhere. Does it come from housing? Does it come from social services? I mean, that's the impact.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is James Braswell from Panelists, and I live in Los Angeles, so I'm sorry. But my question, I'm going to take the bait because politics surrounding the Bureau of Reclamation were just mentioned. But going back to the last panel, also talking about the kind of change in how the environment is treated, it seems like there's been a fairly large cultural change with the federal government and all the local governments here. So with the administration change and the leadership at the Department of Interior, how much of a threat is that? And I would love to tell you that for you to tell me that that's a simplistic question and it doesn't matter, but I need to ask anyways. So is the current leadership at the Department of the Interior or the Bureau of Reclamation, how much is that affecting the trend of environmental thinking when it comes to the Colorado River?
It was when this new administration came into place, the sky was going to fall, right? Gloom and doom in terms of the environment. But, we took the stance of like, wow, this is an opportunity. I mean, we have to look at it as an opportunity in terms of how we move forward. And given the nature of, what can happen with politics on a national level, we really saw that we need to refocus even more on a regional level because of the disconnect with what's happening in the basin versus what may be happening at a federal level. And so I really think that's going to be, when we talk about a new paradigm of policy, I think it's switching more to regional areas.
So we're going to wrap up. I just have a final question for the panel, and I didn't give them this ahead of time, so maybe give them a half second to think. But if you could have your sort of pie in the sky change in law or policy, or say a tool or a set of tools to address these challenges going forward, what would that be? Anybody can start.
Starting with me, I guess I'll just take up one of the challenges I heard from the tribes during the development of the tribal water study, is that it's often very difficult to manage their water if they have water in multiple states, because states have different regulations, they have different laws. They can't. So if you have some water in California and you have some water in Arizona, like Colorado River Indian tribes, they have a whole different set of regulations that they may have to follow, and they can't manage across those states. So perhaps finding ways to be more continuity, and if probably you can't have anything exactly the same, but if they could be more complementary, it might help tribes manage their water better when they're across multiple states.
And for me, it would just be, you know, the openness to actually addressing long-range planning and changing the law of the river. I mean, and that's, you know, for me, and that's the only pathway that I see in terms of, you know, ability to have tribes conclude it in a structured manner, to be able to participate in this. And why is it important? You know, equity, as we talked about, social justice and those kind of things. But, you know, it's about, you know, what all of us, you know, that do Colorado River work are committed in one way or another to the sustainability of the Colorado River. And if you stand on Morales Dam and you look out and you look south, there is no river. And each of us, you know, relies on this who live in the basin. And for us, you know, the reality is that we're less than 1% of the population in the basin. So we have basically hardly any political capital. And so, you know, how is it that we engage, you know, and stress the importance of why we need to participate as tribes? It really lies in our ability to create relatedness.
And I guess since I've been given the opportunity to make a giant pie in the sky, I think it would be incredible to think about the river first as a river and second as a delivery mechanism. And I think the only way to do that is to have some kind of base flows that are dedicated to the environment, and then have sectoral allocations that shrink and swell relative to availability of supplies, which is pretty similar to approaches that have been taken in Australia. That being said, the governance of an approach like that is at least as difficult as the governance issues that we have today. And so the ultimately difficult component of this is governance.
Well, on that note, thank you all for participating, and thanks everybody for their questions.